Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on this first episode of Race for Water Foundation Meets the Experts webinar series. My name is Camille Rollin. I have been working for Race for Water since 2016, and I'm currently in charge of our program called ACT. First, let me give you a few technical points. It's probably not the first webinar for you, but it is definitely the first time we organize a digital event, so please be tolerant with us. Please also note that today's webinar is recorded and will be shared more broadly afterwards, hopefully by all of you as well. If you have any questions to ask during today's presentation, you can find the Q&A section accessible on the right side of your screen. Please enter your name and your organization before sending your question. It will help us to properly manage the Q&A session, which will be held after our speaker's presentation. We will do our best to answer them all today. I am really excited today. First, because we have an amazing diversity of profiles in the audience, with more than 200 people registering, coming from all over the planet. Peru, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Dominican Republic, Bermuda, Guadeloupe, the US, Canada, many countries in Europe, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, China, South Africa, Ghana, Australia, Fiji, Tonga, from what I could identify. We have people from private sector, we have people from governments, international organizations, regulatory institutions, NGOs, civilians. Some we met during our worldwide expeditions, but also new joiners in our community that we are happy to see growing. The second reason why I am really excited today is because we have the chance to share knowledge with well-known experts on their fields in a subject that is certainly not broadcasted enough, despite its huge implications for every one of us. But first, let me quickly speak about Race for Water. And for that, I'm going to share a few slides. So you should see my slide right now. So this Swiss foundation was created in 2010 by Marco Simeoni, a Swiss entrepreneur and a sailor who decided 10 years ago to devote his entrepreneurial skills to ocean preservation with the clear mission of developing social and economic models that encourage plastic waste reduction and collection in order to prevent plastic leakage into our waterways. Through worldwide expeditions, we continuously investigate the plastic pollution issue and deploy our Learn, Share and Act programs. Learn is to contribute to the scientific knowledge by hosting scientific missions on board and in some specific regions all along our journey. Share is dedicated to raising awareness with schools and general public, but also alert decision makers through workshops and conferences organized on board at each stopover. Finally, ACT is dedicated to the identification and the facilitation of solutions implementation to stop ocean plastic pollution. These three programs have three strategic goals. The first two are to reduce and rethink plastic so that we reach a reasonable and relevant production and consumption of plastic with a material that is healthy, reusable, and easy to integrate in a true circular economy. The third objective is to work towards an optimized plastic waste management with incentivized collecting system, local and safe waste management infrastructures funded by the entire plastic value chain industry. Usually, Race for Water Foundation tackled the plastic pollution crisis through the spectrum of plastic waste and its direct impact on the marine environment, and then consequently on human health. But the long journey we started 10 years ago to understand ocean plastic pollution allowed us to meet some amazing experts who put things differently, bringing new perspective to the problem and its solution. Our webinar speakers have dedicated their career to alert on the dangers that are brought by the way we are currently dealing with our chemical and consequently plastic industry. I was personally shocked when I listened to them the first time during the Plastic Health Summit held in Amsterdam a year ago. And since then, I can't stop thinking that more people should have access to this knowledge. This was confirmed while discussing with people from the consumer good industry. I realized some senior executives on major brands do not know enough about health risks coming with plastic. It is now time for me to introduce our experts of the day. So, women first. Today, we are sharing the floor with Dr. Jane Munke. Good afternoon, Jane. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks.
Good. So, Jane holds a doctorate degree in environmental toxicology and an MSc in environmental science from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. She was trained in analytical chemistry and ecotoxicology. Jane worked at Novaquatis, an interdisciplinary research project on urban water management aiming at reducing chemical pollutants in the aquatic environment. After postdoctoral work in the area of endocrine disruption screening in zebrafish, Dr. Munke joined Emhart Glass, a supplier company to the container glass industry, where she analyzed scientific information on food contact materials, migrations, and impacts on human and environmental health. Since August 2012, she is working for the Food Packaging Forum as Managing Director and Chief Scientific Officer. Jane is a full scientific member of the Society of Toxicology, the American Chemical Society, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, and the Endocrine Society. What an impressive career already. We also have with us John Peterson, most known as Pete Myers. Good morning, Pete. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. How are you?
I am fine, thank you very much. So, Pete is the founder and chief scientist of Environmental Health Sciences, a non-for-profit organization that promotes public understanding in scientific research on environmental and human health, especially on how chemical exposure, even at low doses, can cause serious adverse effects. He received a doctorate in the biological sciences from Berkeley. For a dozen years, he served as director of the W. Alton Jones Foundation in Charlottesville, Virginia. He also co-wrote Our Stolen Future, a best-selling book that explored the scientific basis of concern for how contamination threatens fetal development. Dr. Myers is actively involved in research on the impacts of endocrine disruption on human health and is an adjunct professor of chemistry at Carnegie Mellon University. Over the last few years, he has received the first Champion of Environmental Health Research award from the U.S. National Institutes of Health and the Laureate Award for Outstanding Public Service from the Endocrine Society. Dr. Munke and Dr. Myers both worked together in the past, and they were really thrilled to be united again to work on a joint presentation for you today. Jane, Pete, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Camille, for this. Thank you so much, Camille, for this really nice introduction. And let me say it's a pleasure to be part of this organization, at least for the next hour and a half. I'm really impressed with the fantastic work that you're doing. So hello, everyone, and thank you for your interest in this topic. We all agree that plastic pollution is a major environmental crisis, and it's great to see that people are getting together and working on solutions for this crisis. One of the solutions that people are looking at is increasing reuse, and a lot of different products are being put out on the market. For example, this bamboo coffee cup made of plastic, actually. And this actually shows us already what one of the big problems is that we're dealing with here. It's the chemicals. Because despite all the good ideas that are out there, the issue of chemicals and chemicals that can transfer from well-meant solutions into food and into the environment is actually often overlooked. So apart from plastic pollution and physical damage to marine life, plastics are also an invisible danger because of their hazardous chemical composition. So let's first turn to what we know about chemicals and human health. Pete, over to you, please.
Great, thank you, Jane. Let me start this up. And share my screen. there. So there's a lot we don't know about plastics and human health, but we know enough to be concerned. That's especially true of the chemicals that leach out of plastics into food. Chemicals like the bisphenols, the phthalates, brominated diphenyl ethers, perfluorinated compounds. Once they get into our bodies, they can wreak many different types of havoc, especially hormone havoc. So I want to start this talk with a personal story. This is my granddaughter, Sierra Rose. Sierra, as in the mountain range in California. She was born just 22 months ago. She was born prematurely, 8 weeks, weighing 2.5 pounds. My daughter Shori was rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night because she developed preeclampsia. That's a life-threatening condition for mother and baby that usually forces an immediate cesarean, which is what happened. As Sierra grows up and learns about this trauma, she might be tempted to shout, "Thank you, plastics." Her survival was only possible with a lot of the neonatal intensive care units' life-saving equipment, a lot of which is plastic. When I think about plastic from this perspective, I have to admit I'm thankful for what it brings us. But there's another side to this story. This is Paradise, California, which burned while my daughter was in her 7th month of pregnancy. When it went up in smoke, so did the volatilized gases of burned plastic and smoke particles contaminated by plastic. This is where the smoke went. Right in the middle of that plume of smoke, that's where my daughter was in her 20th week of pregnancy, in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the smoke as it hit San Francisco. You know what happens when pregnant women are exposed to chemicals that get into smoke like this? It's a risk factor for preeclampsia, the very thing that forced the cesarean section. It's entirely plausible, even if not certain, that the same plastics that created the life-saving materials in the hospital could have been the cause of Sierra's premature birth, which forces us to ask, how can we have let such miracle materials into our world without understanding their true dangerous nature? And how can we go about fixing that? That's the focus of my comments today. So what are the realities of plastic toxicity? First of all, there are thousands of different types of plastics. You begin with this well-known figure of recycling numbers, and they represent different monomers. Vinyl chloride is the monomer from which polyvinyl chloride is made. Styrene is the monomer from which polystyrene is made. Bisphenols are actually a collection of plastic materials that are all classified as other. But unfortunately, it's not just the monomer that's dangerous. I'll go into more detail about the hazardous characteristics of bisphenol and others later. So it's not just the monomer, it's also additives to plastic. It's non-intentionally added substances, which are reaction byproducts. Jane will explain them later in the talk. And what this means is that there are literally hundreds of thousands of different types of plastic. And the additives can be toxic, and the NIAS can be toxic. How did we give miracle plastics a free pass? When plastic was really entering into society in the 1950s and 60s, it seemed inert. And also toxicology back then just worried about high doses because they didn't realize some of the science that has been discovered since. And as the plastic became widespread, especially in the 80s and 90s, new epidemics of chronic diseases have appeared, many of them related to hormonal dysfunction. Here's a simple list of some of the ones for which we now have significant scientific proof are risk factors, or have plastic chemicals as risk factors in their causation. Infertility, autoimmunity, obesity, asthma, diabetes. Actually, there's a lot more on the list. Chemists discovered what's called our body burden. They started measuring what chemicals are actually inside us, what synthetic chemicals, and they discovered that lots of plastic chemicals have somehow managed to enter into our bodies. The levels usually are low by standards of conventional toxicology. I'll return to that point later. But even though the levels are low, as scientists, epidemiologists, other types of scientists began studying the consequences of having plastic chemicals in our bodies. They found strong links between those chemicals and these epidemics. Here are three really strong examples. The bisphenols, BPA, and their replacements, phthalates, DEHP, and other types of phthalates, and the perfluorinated compounds. The sorts of diseases and deformities and conditions that are related to bisphenols, phthalates, and perfluorinated chemicals include infertility. A fascinating study came out of Italy a couple of years ago showing that boys growing up in an area of heavy perfluorinated chemical contamination actually had smaller penises. That's not it's the only finding. Bisphenols, wonderful work being done in Spain by Angel Nadal, shows that very low doses of bisphenols, well within the range that we experience, can contribute to diabetes, which is rising in epidemic proportions today. But this raises the question, well, how do these chemicals get from plastic into our bodies? Jane?
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, so as the name of my organization already says, I work for the Food Packaging Forum, and we focus on food packaging, but there's actually also a good reason for doing so. First of all, as most of you probably are aware, packaging is the most important sector for plastics, and of that, probably half of it or even more goes into food packaging. And then again, if you look at how much of the food that we consume actually is packaged, you can see from this study that was recently published coming out of Portugal, it's more than half. And if we look at a breakdown of the materials that are used to package food, you can see plastics is by far the most abundant type of packaging material. But then also some of the other materials have a direct plastic layer in direct food contact. And so this is true for the multi-layer multi-materials here, which is another fancy term for beverage cartons. But also a lot of paper and board has synthetic coatings, and also metal packaging has a synthetic coating. And then also glass jars oftentimes have a lid which has a coating on the inside. So really most of the food that we consume, which is packaged, has some kind of direct contact with plastic. So why do we care about that? Well, because the chemicals, as Pete already mentioned, that are present in plastics, they can transfer from the packaging material into the food. And you can see that here in this illustration, the little red dots are small molecules that are in your plastic. So for example, they are unreacted monomers, they are additives, or they are what Pete already introduced, non-intentionally added substances, the NIAS. We'll get to that term in a second. And these molecules, they can transfer into the foodstuff. But also, plastic is not a barrier material. And so some of the chemicals that are outside of the packaging, for example, if you have printing inks or you have adhesives on the label, they can go through the bottle and get into your foodstuff as well. And another quick point here that I want to make, chemicals in the sense of molecules that are present in your foodstuff, for example, think of vitamins or think of flavor molecules. These are also all chemicals, natural, but they're still chemicals. They can transfer from your foodstuff into the packaging. And this process is known as flavor scalping. So your packaging actually becomes a sink for chemicals, flavor molecules, but maybe also contaminants that shouldn't be in the packaging. So this process of migration, as we call it in the technical term, this transfer of chemicals, it's really controlled by several different factors, predominantly heat. So at higher temperatures, you have increasing migration. The storage time plays an important role. If you have longer storage time, you will get increasing levels in your foodstuff. Key really also is the chemistry of your food and also the chemistry of your packaging material. Packaging size is important. If you have small size packaging, you really are increasing the surface area to volume ratio. So you have more packaging proportionally in contact with your volume of food in smaller packaging. And therefore, in small packaging, you also have proportionally higher migration levels. And the most important aspect really are the levels of the chemicals that migrate to start off with in your food packaging. And this is actually most often actually unknown, so it's difficult to estimate. So what are the types of chemicals that are used to make food contact materials? And this actually is breaking news. We today published this study here where we put together a database, the food contact chemical database. So these are chemicals worldwide that we found to be listed on government inventories or industry lists for the manufacture of food contact materials. I don't know if all of these chemicals are being used, but this is the best information we can get. So we put together this database. It contains 12,285 chemicals. And for some of them, not all, we could find toxicity data. And then based on the toxicity data, we then ranked these chemicals according to their hazard properties. And what we came up with is a list of 608 most hazardous chemicals. So these are really the very worst, which we recommend to just not use when you make food packaging. We can look into that a little bit later. And these are the types of effects that these chemicals have. So Pete introduced endocrine disruption already. There also are chemicals that are of high concern for the environment because they have aquatic toxicity or because they're persistent and bioaccumulative. Some of these chemicals also contribute or possibly contribute to cancer because they're carcinogenic or mutagenic. Now, what do we know about how many different chemicals actually can migrate from food contact chemical materials into food? So I showed you this list of over 12,000 chemicals that are likely to be used when we make food contact materials, but there are more. And this is a slide by an enforcement officer here from Switzerland, where I live. He put this together and he actually estimates potentially migrating substances or chemicals, which is a synonym, are up to 100,000 different ones. Now, why 100,000? Pete introduced this already. It's our 12,200 something of the intentionally used chemicals, plus what we call the non-intentionally added substances. So these are impurities of your starting substances because you're not using purest grade chemicals, but they're also reaction byproducts. When you make your polymers, it's a very aggressive chemical reaction. You have reaction byproducts, and then it's also breakdown products of your additives. So for example, if you put an antioxidant into plastic, which protects the polymer from getting attacked chemically, the antioxidant does its job, and by doing its job, it degrades into another substance. So you have this whole long list of potentially migrating substances up to 100,000. Key point here is that many of these actually are unknown. And then just compare it to the substances that are effectively controlled in Europe. Here we're looking at 100 or less chemicals. So you have the listed substances, which are 12,000 something, specifically regulated substances for plastic food contact in Europe are about 1,000, and then effectively controlled substances less than 100. So that is the status quo right now. Okay, so now you may say, okay, so we've got all these chemicals, some of them migrate, okay, that we also know. No one's dropping dead from being exposed to these chemicals. The levels that migrate are low, and that is actually the assumption that there shouldn't be any, oh, sorry, I lost my swag here. I wanted to say this first. What do we think about the safety? Are these chemicals safe that migrate? Well, to you and me, what we think safe means is there are no untested chemicals in the food packaging, and there are no hazardous chemicals in the food packaging. What the right migration actually says, and here's the legal definition of the European migration: materials and articles shall be manufactured so that under normal or foreseeable conditions of use, they do not transfer their constituents to food in quantities which could endanger human health. So it's about the quantities. So we get back to the levels, as I was saying before. The levels at which they migrate are not to endanger human health. So basically what the regulation assumes here is that low levels are safe levels. But that is not a justified assumption based on what we know from the current scientific understanding. And Pete, over to you again to explain to us, please, why that is the case.
Thank you, Jane. So as scientists have dug into this question of what is safe and what is not, there are some painful realizations that are, emerge from that study. Most chemicals, as Jane said, have simply not been tested, ever. The tests that have been used are flawed and outdated. The core assumptions that structure how they are tested are wrong. And unfortunately, because there's so much money at stake, sometimes analyses are manipulated to hide problems. So scientists started to ask new questions. Could low doses be relevant? Because we're actually seeing links between what's in people today and that litany of epidemics that I listed earlier. So think about this. What is a part per billion? It sounds like a small amount. Actually, a part per billion is about one pancake in a stack of pancakes 4,000 miles high. Sounds like a little amount. But flip that question around. Let's imagine you have a drop of water. And in that drop of water, there is bisphenol A at a concentration of 1 part per billion. How many molecules of BPA do you think would be in that drop of water at that concentration? There actually are roughly 202.65 trillion molecules of BPA. There are a lot more molecules of water, 1 billion times more. But when only a few molecules of BPA can cause a problem, having 2.65 trillion in a drop, that is a big issue. So then we began to learn things that no one knew when plastics first began to enter the marketplace. And most crucially, what we didn't understand in the early 50s and into the 60s was that hormones, our native chemical messengers, guide gene expression. They turn genes on and off. And when that happens, and it's very low doses of hormones that do that, very low, part per trillion, part per billion. And when gene expression goes awry, bad things happen. Well, it turns out that endocrine disrupting compounds hack that signaling system. That's the problem at low doses. This is a key player in the study of bisphenol A. His name is Fred Vom Saal. He's a distinguished professor of endocrinology at the University of Missouri. In 1994, as I was writing Our Stolen Future with Theo Colborn and Diane Dumanovsky, Fred showed me a graph that utterly destroyed my faith in regulatory testing. And here is that graph. And what it does is it shows for one particular endocrine disrupting compound, diethylstilbestrol or DES, it shows that compared to the controls, a dose of 200 nanograms per gram decreases prostate weight, which is a bad sign of adult health. And that exposure is actually in the womb. It's a dose that's delivered to the pregnant mother. What Fred showed was that if you work down the dose response curve at lower and lower doses, you see that prostate sizes actually increased at a low dose compared to the control, and also increased compared to the high dose. And here's the problem. Regulatory toxicology bought into the 16th century a belief first proposed by a Swiss genius named Paracelsus that the dose makes the poison. That has been interpreted to mean that if you don't see effects at high doses, you most certainly won't see them at low. But this graph was the first of many in the study of endocrine disruption that demonstrates low doses can have effects that are not detectable by high dose experiments. Actually, this concept has been common in endocrinology and hormones for a long time. It was the surprise was finding that endocrine disrupting compounds behave like hormones. Well, actually, it's not a surprise, it's what they do. And this was an epiphany. I want to show you a very simple example, very graphic example of the same phenomenon. These are mice from one experiment done by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences showing two types of mice. The same strain of mice, same caloric intake, same activity level. What's the difference? The fat mouse was exposed to 1 part per billion right after birth of an endocrine disrupting compound. It made it morbidly obese as it grew up. Okay, so a very low dose can have a big adverse effect. But what happens if that obese animal, instead of getting 1 part per billion, had been exposed to 1,000 parts per billion of that same compound? You might think it would be at risk of blowing up. Well, that's actually not what happens. It is scrawny, it's thinner than the control animal. So different things happen at different doses. That's the key to this phenomenon. Different genes are being turned on at low doses compared to high doses. Sometimes the genes at high doses, turned on by high doses, even turn off the genes that are turned on by low doses. And what that totally does is it blows out of the water the concept that you can use high dose testing to test for low dose effects. All regulatory testing is based upon this assumption as it is practiced around the world. But if the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, were to realize their own data that they themselves gathered on bisphenol A safety, BPA safety, using 21st century science instead of 15th century science, the safe dose of BPA calculated in the standard way would need to be reduced by a factor of at least 20,000-fold. 20,000-fold lower than the level that the FDA currently considers safe using 15th century science. And it turns out it's not just the next generation exposed in the womb that are affected by endocrine disrupting compounds and other types of toxicants. This is a family, grandmother, mother, daughter, granddaughter. It turns out that there are phenomena now well established in endocrine disruption and in other areas of toxicology that demonstrate that exposures to grandmother can be manifest in granddaughter even without a change in DNA sequence. It's got a fancy name, it's called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, but I guarantee you no regulatory test looking for adverse effects in people, adverse risks in people, has ever considered transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So this may be the most famous physician in America, at least, Dr. House. What's the first thing he's going to ask you when he gives you a prescription? He's going to ask you, what other drugs are you taking? Because drugs interact in your body. What question does regulatory toxicology never answer? What are the consequences of mixtures? So this is another huge flaw in the assumptions that regulatory toxicology currently makes. Fortunately, right now there's a big effort underway in Europe to introduce this phenomenon called the cocktail effect into regulatory toxicology, but we're not there yet. So what can be done? What are the barriers to change? I'll turn it over to Jane.
Thank you, Pete. And we will go back to food packaging. And one of the things that I want to say about food packaging, oops, you're not seeing my slides yet. Here, there you go. As I said before, everything, almost everything is in plastic. So it's very, very hard to avoid exposure to plastics. And I think this needs to be explained a little bit more in detail why that is the case. So let's take a look at the functions of food packaging. So actually, a great Frenchman, Nicolas Appert, he's probably the one who should be attributed with having invented food packaging back in the 19th century. And at the day and time, one of the big challenges was to prevent spoilage of food, to enable long-term storage of the food, and to keep pests out. And that's exactly what Nicolas Appert's invention did. So here, really the key function, the disruptive change, if you wish, was to enable this long-term storage of food. Obviously, over the last decades and century and a half, a lot of other functions have been added to food packaging. First and mostly also to preserve the flavor, to keep the oxygen out, to keep moisture out, because who wants to eat oat biscuits that are all soft and not nice and crisp and crunchy? To keep CO2 in, because when you drink a fizzy drink with the gas inside, the gas can get out through the packaging if the packaging isn't a perfect barrier. And so you really want to keep that fizziness in, because a lemonade doesn't taste so good without the fizz. You also want to keep the light out, because ultraviolet light degrades vitamins, for example. It changes the taste. Think of white wine that's been in the sun too long. You want to advertise the product. There's some very iconic shapes of bottles that have been around for over 100 years. And then in the last sort of, I'd say 60 years, with increasing industrialization, food packaging really has become a super highly engineered product. It enables traceability, for example. Think of RFID codes. It enables high throughput production. A lot of the food that is produced by large food brands is produced in central locations. So you have filling lines which run 24/7 the whole time and filling food into the packaging. So you have this really industrialized high throughput production, and you need packaging that is suitable to work in this kind of setup. Of course, you also need to convey information to consumers. So you've got all the different labels, you've got the ingredients. You enable convenience, which is really the thing about supermarkets. You enable the logistics of complex global supply chains when you transport packaging across the world, and so on and so forth. So I think you get the picture. Packaging is more than just something that you and I interact with as consumers. There's really a whole rat's tail of supply chain behind it, and the packaging has to work in all stages of that supply chain. And that really makes it difficult to switch out packaging, because you're not just changing one material and swapping it out for another, or taking out one chemical and swapping it out for another. You really have to think about this whole supply chain. And especially these high throughput production lines, they work for one type of packaging. That's it. You can't just change beverage cartons to deposit glass bottles. It's not going to work at that scale. And you have what we call a lock-in situation here, because you make very high capital investments into these filling lines, for example, and you have to amortize that over 10, 20 years. So it really doesn't allow you a lot of wiggle room to play around with different packaging types. So I think that's a really important aspect to understand about food packaging, but also other types of packaging. Now, increasingly, people are talking about the circular economy, and here people are saying we need to reduce our resource consumption, we have to decrease our energy use, we have to decouple economic growth from consumption, reuse and recycle food packaging. These are all things that are being discussed in the context of the circular economy. And I get back to what I said right at the beginning, there's no focus on chemical safety when we talk about alternatives to plastic packaging here. On the other hand, I think you've heard enough about this now already. In what I call the food contact world, we know about migration, we know about chemical safety. So these are all the aspects that are discussed here. Right now, there's a disconnect between these two worlds. There's really not enough talk within governments even between the people who are working on solutions to waste, packaging waste, and the people who are working on improving food contact materials. And just to give you one example of concern, but there are many others, this is a well-researched problem here in Europe. Consumer goods that are intended for the use in food contact have been found to be made with highly toxic brominated flame retardants containing plastics. And the hypothesis here is that this was illicit recycling of electronic waste, which contains flame retardants. The plastic is then recycled and turned into these new products for food contact. Of course, for food contact, you're not allowed to have brominated flame retardants in there. But when you recycle plastic, it just looks like black plastic. You don't know what the chemical composition is of the plastic. And so here people were well-intentioned, trying to save resources, recycle plastic, and putting highly, highly toxic chemicals into direct food contact. This is a big, big problem. We've actually studied this in detail, not only looking at plastics, but also paper and board, which is recycled very much. And increasingly, countries are not allowing the use of recycled paper and board for direct food contact because it contains a lot of hazardous chemicals. Oftentimes, they get into the paper and board from the printing inks. So you can have a look at this here. So this is really an important topic. We can't just say, let's ramp up recycling rates. We have to be very careful which materials are suitable for recycling into food contact again. And by the same token, we also have to be careful which materials are suitable for reusing in sort of closed loop applications, because you remember I told you before, plastics, but also paper and board, for example, can absorb chemicals also. So you may get discoloring of your reuse item, your coffee cup, for example, or the flavor gets absorbed. Or if you, by mistake, get some hazardous chemicals inside, they can also be absorbed and then migrate out later again. So it's a big challenge. India actually has banned recycling of plastics altogether for food contact. And the way forward, so Pete mentioned this already, the European Union just very recently, a month ago, released its chemical strategy for sustainability. And in this strategy, there is a requirement for testing of endocrine disrupting chemicals and food contact materials, and also testing of mixture toxicity. So all the chemicals, the cocktail of chemicals that migrate from the packaging into food together need to be addressed. Europe is planning a regulatory overhaul on food contact materials regulation by the end of 2022. And also in the US, we see a lot of activity also in other countries around the world. I just picked out these two right now, but there's much more going on in other places also. Stakeholders are getting active. So in March, actually, this should be 2018, I apologize. This list, the Food Safety Alliance for Packaging, published a list of food safety stewardship considerations. They're calling it, it's basically a blacklist of hazardous chemicals that should not be found in food packaging. And who is this group? These are big brands. So this was spearheaded by Nestle, Mars Wrigley, and other really big international food brands who are telling their suppliers, we don't want these chemicals in our packaging. So that's a good start. There are other lists and other resources. I think importantly, what we need to see moving forward is to have an integration of these two topics, chemical safety for food contact materials, food contact plastics, and circular economy, reuse, recycling. This needs to be merged much more in the future. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. Okay, so, but the reality of things is that some plastic uses are essential. Pete mentioned his granddaughter. Blood bags, IV tubes in the hospital, but also to be fair, for food packaging, I'm sure we're not going to replace plastic from one day to the next. Here I want to refer to the essential use concept, which is a very useful concept that may help us to sort out which plastic uses actually are essential and which are not, so which are the ones where we should strive for replacement. But for the plastics that society deems as being essential, how can we improve the chemistry? And I hand over to Pete again to tell us how this can happen.
Thank you, Jane. I will pull up my screen here. So this was quite a headline that came out reporting on a new scientific finding in September of 2019. 3/4 of plastic products tested were toxic. Here's the reference, benchmarking the in vitro toxicity and chemical composition of plastic consumer products. That's quite a shocker, but it's holding up as a result. If you don't test, you don't know. Some people are proposing that, oh, we can use computers to figure out what's toxic and what's not. Well, there is motion forward in using artificial intelligence and other types of computational approaches, but right now it's not ready for prime time. You've got to test with organisms, whole organisms. Also, I told you about one set of assumptions that or several assumptions that drive toxicity testing and how they're wrong. Well, sometimes the assumption that low doses are okay are translated into, depending upon thresholds of toxicological concern. And I hope you understand by now that using assumptions without testing is simplistic and it's dangerous hand-waving. Turns out bio-based plastics can be toxic too. That was quite a shocker when that study came out. If you don't use 21st century science to test, you don't know. So here we are at the mid-stage of what is turning out to be a exponential growth in global plastic production. It's headed through the roof according to the industry's own calculations. This is a slide from industry. There's going to be a lot more plastic around in the future than there is now, and we've got to figure out how to reduce the use, and also how do we intervene intelligently to make the plastic safer. One dark and stormy night, I had an epiphany as I was lecturing to a group of chemists in Camden, New Jersey. It was the Society of Plastics Engineers, people who make stuff out of plastic. Make good things, make bad things, but didn't know very much about plastic toxicity, so they asked me to come and talk to them. And it was at a time when the issue of endocrine disruption was just getting on the society's radar screen. And it was a very contentious meeting because the chemical engineers did not like what I had to say. Camden, New Jersey, for those of you who know the US and grew up around Camden in the 1960s, know that that's where the mob used cement overshoes to get rid of people they didn't like. They put your feet in buckets with wet cement and threw you into the river. So here I am in Camden, New Jersey on a dark and stormy night, telling a large group of people things they don't want to hear. It was very contentious. It was finally over. We had thrown spears at one another, verbal spears. And I ended my talk. Everyone left except for two big guys in the back of the room. And as everyone left, they started to walk toward me. And frankly, I was afraid because I was thinking of cement overshoes. And they walk up and they say, Dr. Myers, we like what you're doing. And I gulped. I said, what? No, we like what you're doing. You are making certain commodities, plastics, unsellable in the marketplace. And we've got the replacement, and we're going to make a lot of money. That I never thought of it that way. But figuring out how to help chemists make safer materials is a way to help chemists make money and to move to a new generation of safer materials. That's what we need to do. We need to help chemists make money. So I think that vision is one of a new day, when biologists like myself and chemists can work together to redesign molecules used in making plastics to make them safer, can reform the regulatory structure so that it reflects modern science, and can animate the public so they demand safer materials be available to them. And I spent 8 years working with about 30 scientists from chemistry and from biology to design an intellectual framework for how to make safer materials. How can we design new chemicals so that they don't disrupt the endocrine system? We published it in Green Chemistry, a publication of the Royal Society of Chemistry, in 2012. It's called Typehead. I won't go into the details, but it is a economically efficient way to make choices about what materials do you want to bring into the next generation of chemistry. So here's my granddaughter yesterday. She's surpassed 30 pounds. She's not out of the woods yet, developmentally delayed as are most preterm kids, but things are looking a lot better. And that brings me to my closing thoughts. We do know enough about plastic toxicity to be concerned, very concerned. But as I just said, we know enough about plastic toxicity to start working with chemists to design safer chemicals and to bring regulatory toxicology into the 21st century and willingly work with communities to support those efforts. I think we can be friends. As we have seen from recent financial consequences of chemical misbehavior by DuPont, Johnson & Johnson, Monsanto Bayer, 3M and others, it's in their own self-interest to come clean. 21st century science is an existential threat to their business model if they don't. The sooner they accept that, the better they will serve their shareholders and all of us citizens on this one planet that we know for certain supports life. So we have a lot of work to do, but we can get with it. And I look forward to answering questions, talking with any and all of you. So thank you very much, Camille. I think we're over.
Thank you so much, Jane and Pete. This was wonderful, a real eye-opener and instructive presentation, I am sure, for our audience too. We had, so please, the audience, just write down some of the questions you might have. There is a slight delay between you writing it down and us seeing it. So, and if you can just add your name and organization, it would be really helpful. I have a first question on my side. I mean, and it would be for Pete, this one. I mean, you've been working on bisphenol and endocrine disruption for like almost 30 years, and how come is it taking so long to put in place a proper regulatory system? Why do we still have BPA and other bisphenol on our products? What you feel are the most like the biggest barrier we have to just get it down?
Thanks. A very important question. The biggest barrier is how people think. We have to leave old broken concepts and start using 21st century science as we move forward. I got real insight into this in 2013 when we were about to publish a huge monograph on the whole issue of does the dose make the poison. In 21st century science language, it's non-monotonic dose response curves, where what happens at low doses isn't the same as what happens at high doses. We published this in the top journal of endocrinology, and to prepare for the publication, we actually met with the US FDA. We invited them to come meet with the authors. There were 13 authors. It took us 5 years to write it, several hundred conference calls at a day during a time period when there was no Zoom. Maybe we could have done it faster had we had Zoom. I was sitting there talking to one of the FDA's top scientists, and she looks at these graphs and she says, "We don't see that." And I said, "Of course you don't. You don't test at those low levels. You never have. As long as you don't test at low levels, you won't see low dose effects." And she looks at me and she says, "Oh, you're right." Well, unfortunately, I overheard her about 10 minutes later going through the same conversation with one of my colleagues. And then a year later, she had left the FDA and was a consultant for a company that defends different chemicals from scientists. And she was earning 10 times what she earned at the FDA. I think that sort of revolving door is a vital aspect of why the regulatory agencies don't move to new science.
Okay, thank you. Jane, today we have a lot of consumer good companies following us on this webinar, and I'm sure given what the Food Packaging Forum is doing, you probably interact with them a lot. What are your, can you maybe explain how is it currently, how does it work to test the product? Do they have a list of chemicals they know shouldn't go into the food packaging material, and then there is, I feel that there is no test done at the when the product is finished. Is it how it's working? So that's the first question. Explain a bit how the testing is currently done, and what are your recommendations given that the regulation we see is not working well? How can companies lead on this on this aspect and guarantee their consumer that their product packaging are safe?
Yeah, thank you, Camille. I think the key really here is safe, and I think there are just different ideas on what safe means. As I tried to highlight in our presentation, currently there's a legal requirement for safety. And there's this acceptance that there are safe thresholds, and that kind of reflects what's being done, what's legally required. So you can only use chemicals that are authorized to make food contact plastics. They have certain migration limits, specific migration limits, and you have to ensure that the chemicals that migrate one by one do not exceed those specific migration limits. In Europe, there's also a requirement to look at what we call the NIAS, so these non-intentionally added substances. But here again, the reality just is that a lot of these chemicals are unknown. And so one of the things that one needs to understand is if you have chemicals that are unknown, you simply cannot do risk assessment the way that it's normally done in regulatory toxicology. So the chemical risk assessment, it's done by looking at two things. First of all, you need to know how much of the chemical migrates into food, and then how much of that food is ingested by a person. So that's kind of your dose in a way. And the other part is you have to know what is the toxicity, what are the hazard properties of that chemical. And then again, you get to this dose makes the poison assumption, right? So the risk is higher if you have high levels or if you have very high toxicity or both. Now, when you have unknown chemicals, you can neither assess the levels because you can't quantify unknown chemicals. You need to know what chemical you are measuring in order to be able to quantify it with reasonable certainty. And you cannot assess the toxicity of an unknown chemical. I think everyone understands that, right? That's very logical. It's a known unknown. So that is a reality. All plastics contain these unknown chemicals. And at the moment, that's it's like an elephant in the room in a way, that these products are on the market. The entire population, I would hazard a guess, is exposed to chemicals that migrate from from plastic into food, but also that get into our environment that we inhale with the air and so on, personal care products, dermal uptake, they're everywhere. And still, we don't know exactly if these chemicals are safe or not. They may be safe, but they may also not be safe. It's just the logic. So this makes it very difficult. So I think for companies, getting back to your question, what can they do? So I think a lot of companies want to do the right thing, but as long as the regulations are so fuzzy, then basically what can they do? They confirm with the regulations, but it's not going to tell us if the end of the packaging that gets into contact with food really is safe, right? So if we just continue to look at the chemicals we use to make the plastic, we're not going to answer that question if the whole cocktail of chemicals migrating into the food is actually safe. So we need to really upstream work on changing the regulation. There are some front runners in the industry for sure. I mentioned the FSAP list, the Food Safety Alliance for Packaging. Nestle is one of the brands that they have a lab where they test the packaging. They actually also look at mixture toxicity, so they run bioassays. I don't know how regularly they do that, but it's something they're looking at. But of course, Nestle is the biggest food producer globally. For all the other food producers, and I'm also thinking of small, medium enterprises, this is really a luxury right now. You know, I mean, they're struggling already to get, you know, through all the red tape and fulfill all the other myriads of requirements, food and safety, hygiene, and so on. And then food packaging. Okay, I imagine they just kind of get the certificates from their suppliers saying, yeah, it complies with regulation, end of story for them. So I think that's really where we need to ultimately get to. We need to change the regulations. They have to reflect scientific understanding much better. These regulations are 40 years old. So a long answer, and maybe just let me add one last thing to my long answer. I understand, for me, I have the easiest position in this whole discussion because I'm not making food. I'm not putting products on the market. It's easy for me to criticize and say, this is not good, that's not good. I understand it's a problem, but I do think, you know, it's simply immoral to put untested chemicals out there on the market and have everyone in the population ingest these on a daily basis without knowing if they're really safe. It's a huge moral problem.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have questions coming in. Thank you to the audience for asking so many. So maybe one for Pete. Let's see. So I've seen one, now I need to find it again. So it's an anonymous question, but so great presentation. I am curious, I understand we can redesign the chemical compound of plastics to prevent detrimental health impacts, but are there steps being done to redesign plastic entirely to have it both healthy plus environmentally safe and okay to enter the ocean, meaning biodegradable?
That's the big question. No one has adopted our protocol completely. There have been companies taking steps. Bauer, in a big German chemical company, is now redesigning IV bags, which if you have medical need for an IV bag right now, which you know for certain is that you're getting phthalates infused in your bloodstream, and Bauer is working with chemists with whom I've worked to try and find a replacement for that. Now that's an IV bag. It may be that the same solution for IV bags, to have them functional, to have them work as well as the phthalate-based IV bags. Maybe that will find a solution in food packaging also, but we're not there yet. I should add, and this in some ways a disclosure, I'm actually on the board of a chemical company. It's a chemical company that is based upon green chemistry, led by a guy named Terry Collins, who is Teresa Heinz Professor of Green Chemistry at Carnegie Mellon University. And he has invented a family of catalysts that mimic nature. And and hyperpotentiate the ability of hydrogen peroxide to oxidize materials. He calculates right now that, and he's done this in order to attack the micropollutants, pharmaceuticals, endocrine disrupting compounds, etc., that wind up in sewage water and that are not removed from sewage water and therefore get back into the rivers and are taken up by water supply systems downstream. That's why he did this. And he now calculates that 1 kilo of his catalyst will be capable of cleaning up 22,500 tons of water. That's movement in the right direction. The company is called sudoc.com. We just started it in February, literally, of this year. We have investors now. We have a staff. We're going to be putting up a website at sudoc.com probably by the end of this week. I'll be happy to take questions about it. It's very exciting to see chemists and biologists working together to solve these problems.
This makes totally sense. Thank you very much. Really a lot of hope then, given after this presentation that shows a lot of terrible things that we have to deal with.
We made a mistake. We made a mistake by not testing plastic, but we didn't have the science to test the plastic when the plastic first got on the market. Now we have the science. Let's use it.
Thank you, Pete. Maybe, I mean, it's also a question for you, Pete, again, sir. What are the best, or even Jane, but what are the best sources of information or review studies for health information about plastic toxicity? It's a question from Eric.
Well, let me answer this for Jane. It's the Food Packaging Forum's website. I'm on the board of the Food Packaging Forum, so another disclosure. But it is the best source of information about plastic toxicity that I know of. And Jane's and her team go to great lengths, not only to do original science, as she has shown you with some of the papers that she mentioned, but also to translate it into accessible forms for lay people. And it's really Jane is a hero in this field.
Thanks, Pete. So Jane, for you a question from Jungning Zoom of Rodomax. He is asking, he wants to know, how does bioplastics movement play a part in food packaging?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really interesting question, and I want to go back to what I mentioned before, the functions of food packaging, which first and foremost are to preserve food and to enable shelf life. And if you think about that functionality, it becomes clear that for certain types of food packaging, a material that spontaneously biodegrades will not do the job well, right? Because that's the last thing you want. You want your packaging to maintain its integrity, because only like that it can protect its food. So I think maybe also just to mention briefly, they're kind of confusing definitions for bioplastic. One of them is that it's made from renewable carbon sources. So it's made through organic plant matter or maybe even secondary waste. But then you can, out of that, you can make sort of the conventional plastics. You can make PET or polyethylene, which we all know do not biodegrade. That's why we have this marine pollution problem, right? On the other hand, bioplastics also can be used to describe these biodegradable plastics. And again, you can have plastics that are made from fossil carbon that can be engineered to be biodegradable. And so in terms of food packaging, I think biodegradability is an aspect which is only interesting for foods that don't need to have a long shelf life. I actually think if you look at the European Union's waste hierarchy, you have composting actually even below recycling, right? So you have reduce, reuse, recycle, compost, and then incinerate is sort of the lowest option. Why is that? Because as soon as you start composting, you're breaking down the materials. So you're losing all the energy and effort that goes into making the material. It's much better to actually reduce reuse. So when you reuse, you keep the material in your closed loop, and the other options are less favorable in the circular economy. Yeah, so I do think, I mean, it's an attractive proposition to have biodegradable materials because it takes care of your plastic pollution issue to a certain extent, but also be careful, you know, not all the biodegradable plastics will degrade in the ambient environment. A lot of them are engineered that they need to have industrial composting facilities for degradation. So it's, you know, it's not as if you can just kind of continue throwing out your plastic packaging, which please don't do that. Don't throw your plastic packaging out. Never. Also, if it says it's biodegradable. Yeah, I think it doesn't give us an easy solution. That's what I want to say right now.
Say, Camille,
sorry, go ahead.
Could I share my screen for a moment to share another source of reliable information?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
I was going to say that it also doesn't answer it has the same toxicity risk than like conventional plastic, because
so those of you who want to follow the news about plastic pollution might want to subscribe to this free newsletter that my organization publishes. It comes out once a week, Monday morning, 9 a.m. East Coast time, every day, every week. And you can subscribe to this for free at the URL that's on the slide. Thanks.
It's one of my favorite sources of information regarding plastic. So a question for Pete from Anhide in Bermuda. In recent US news, the public has been ignoring science. How can we swing back to paying attention to science and making it easy, understandable to the lay person?
Great question. I think that we're in better shape now than we were a month ago. We're getting science back into the decision-making process. Many people and organizations are working to help the incoming administration think about restoring the integrity of science as it's practiced in the US. And there are also organizations like mine and Jane's that are hard at work to help the public understand science. There was a fantastic book that's going to come out in February, written by Shauna Swan, who is one of the world's leading epidemiologists who has studied how and why, over the last 60 years, sperm counts in men have declined by over 50%. It's almost certainly related to phthalate exposure, and this book is fabulous. If you want to understand this threat, this real threat to fertility in people around the world, get Shauna Swan's book. It will be called Countdown, 2 words. It'll be out in February.
Okay, thanks, Pete. A question for Dr. Jane Munke from Jasmine from the Save the Med Foundation. To what extent are packaging companies looking at reusable solutions, deposit return schemes versus disposable products? Is this a viable way forward?
Thank you, Jasmine. That's an excellent question. I wish they were doing it more. I fear that it's a little bit like sawing on the branch that you're sitting on, if it's the packaging companies, because of course their business model is single-use packaging. And they have enabled a lot of other business models with the single-use packaging. So I think the challenge here really is, yeah, it's a big word, systemic change. That's really what we need. We need to look at what are the products that we consume in single-use packaging, and is there a way to deliver that service of food or other products that usually come in single-use packaging in a different way? So I often say that packaging and plastic pollution, they're actually not the problem, they're the symptom of a larger problem. And that, of course, makes it a bit more difficult to address. If you look at sort of the big system, which is how do we produce and consume foods? How do we produce and consume products? That, to me, that really is the root cause here. And that it's very difficult to address that, I realize that, but only if we do make that effort to try and understand the complexity of the system, to understand the different factors that affect each other, we will manage to develop robust solutions that, and here I'm channeling Pete, which is one of his favorite things to say, solutions that don't turn into tomorrow's problems. Because I just remind you, plastic packaging was a great solution 15 years ago or 20 years ago. People were saying, oh, we can reduce carbon emissions. Yeah, let's put everything in plastic. Let's lightweight the packaging. And now we've got this whole big problem with plastic pollution. And that's exactly what we have to try and avoid. I know it's difficult, but I would love to see some enlightened packaging companies who kind of completely reinvent themselves. They move from their single-use business model to saying, okay, we're going to rent out packaging. That's what we're going to do. We're not going to sell it. We're going to rent it out. And people use our packaging to put their products in it. Then they bring it back. We clean it. We put it out on the market again. Something like that. So we absolutely have to go in that direction.
Thank you, Jane. A question for Pete now from Vincent de Cap, Zero Plastic Oceans. He's in Panama. So thank you for the excellent content and insights, mind-blowing. However, given the variety of chemicals mixed, joint interactions and such, I assume it is extremely hard to make a link between this chemical cocktail and specific diseases, especially that these same diseases may be caused from many other sources. What is your strategy, way forward, to try and improve the toxicity so that changes can happen?
That is a very perceptive question, very perceptive. And there are multiple sources of evidence that help us understand what's causing specific risks. These diseases, this wave of epidemics, are all multifactorial. Many things contribute to them. That's diet, independent of what bad chemicals are in it, exercise, lots of different things contribute to the epidemic of those diseases. And what you have to do is you have to piece together different sources of information. So there are epidemiologists who are doing very complicated, long-term, multi-million-dollar studies that look at what they can measure in people and how and whether or not the risk of a disease, specific disease, changes with the amount that's in people. That's one type of information. Then you need molecular information about what are the mechanisms that cause that disease, and is what you're discovering through studying cells consistent with what you're finding in epidemiology. And thirdly, you have animal studies that you do to try as models to see if what you can discover from the animal studies is consistent. So you bring together these different pieces of evidence and ask, where is the consistency? Where does it fall apart? And it takes a long time. But out of the mess, out of all the noise, emerge very significant signals.
Can I add something, Camille?
Sure.
Yeah, of course, I completely agree with what Pete said. But I think there's the science and then there's the societal decision making. And as Pete said, the science can take a long time to emerge. And we, as society, as human society, we already now, we can say we don't want these chemicals. We don't want them in our bodies. We don't want them getting into the environment. And as soon as we say that, we can do something about it. We don't have to wait for all the scientific evidence to emerge. And of course, it's a messy and complicated discussion because a lot of people have a lot to lose if that would be the direction that society would move forward in. But I do think we need to keep that as an option in our minds. We don't have to wait for more certainty from the science. We can say already now, we don't want it. We don't want unknown, untested chemicals, and we certainly don't want the known hazardous ones.
Europe is taking a lead on this now with the strategy that Jane mentioned that they just announced in October, the chemical strategy for sustainability. It's an awesome document. It takes the approach that Jane just mentioned. We're just going to say no to certain types of things. Endocrine disrupting chemicals cannot be used in certain ways, period. We don't need to have the proof. But here's what we're looking at now. Because of what Jane just mentioned, that a lot of people have a lot to lose, there's going to be a big fight over how is this strategy going to be implemented. And while the way it's written is beautiful, there's a lot of wiggle room in there. And so I know that NGOs and scientists and medical specialists in Europe are going to be watching the process very, very closely and trying to make sure it moves in the right direction.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a really ambitious proposition a year ago, and I already saw that I mean, for me, there is one thing that is key in this is the transparency of what is inside the packaging. And this is completely opaque because of industrial secrecy or whatever. And it was supposed to be part of the proposition, of the law proposition, to be like, so that they have to say what is the composition of their packaging. And apparently it's written out already. So how come, I mean, scientists can't just, given the amount of chemicals that of molecules you have on the packaging, on the market, I mean, if it's not transparent from the scratch, if scientists has to look at find out what is in the packaging, it's already such a loss of time. So yeah, there is a big, it's hopeful what's happening in Europe, but there is a big fight back from lobby, obviously. So question from VJ, Philadelphia Water Department. Great presentation. What are your thoughts on using fluorescence spectroscopy for studying the leaking of additive chemicals from plastic into water? Who wants to answer that?
Thanks, Vijay, for that question. I am not up to date on that methodology, so I can't really comment on it at all. I think in general, one of the challenges really is, as I said before, if you want to quantify chemicals that migrate from plastic packaging into water, for example, you need to know what those chemicals are that you're looking at. So in analytical chemistry, that's called targeted analysis. And for that, you have to have the identity of the chemical, and you need to have the chemical available as a pure substance so that you can calibrate your measurement equipment. Again, if you've got hundreds and hundreds of chemicals, many of them unknown, that migrate from plastic into water, it's going to be difficult, very, very difficult. So that is one of the super challenging issues with getting a handle on the chemical composition, as Camille just said. If we don't know what's being used, it's just very difficult. So yeah, I don't know what else to say to that. I mean, I have to look into it. If you have a link, share that, please.
I would add one comment to that, which is that there are labs in American universities, and I'm sure in universities in other countries, that are developing tools called untargeted analysis, where they don't assume they know what it is. And I'm not a chemist, so I can't explain it. But Roy Girona at the University of California, San Francisco, is one of the world leaders in this, in pioneering untargeted analyses. And I would look him up in Mr. Google.
Okay, thanks. Maybe, yeah, okay, we have 5 minutes left. Let's try one or two more. So Luca Reggiani from Lugano, plastic packages are not safe. What about paper, aluminum, glass? It makes sense to replace plastic packaging with the older and traditional ones? I guess maybe Jane?
Thank you for that question, Luca. Again, I think it's tempting to think about drop-in solutions. Let's replace one packaging with the other. I hope I made it clear in my presentation that that is not so easy to do, especially because you have these filling lines and they only work for certain materials. But then again, one of the biggest gatekeepers for change, at least according to the way I perceive the system, are the retailers. We haven't talked about that at all yet, but basically the retailers are the ones who decide what comes on the shelves of the supermarkets. And if they don't like a packaging material for whatever reason, it's not going to feature on your shelves. And so in the past, I think, especially for glass, retailers have been reluctant because it breaks, it's messy. I think going back to single-use glass is not a good idea in itself, because the emissions of carbon dioxide are very high if we make single-use glass. So I think the way forward would definitely have to involve some kind of reuse scheme, deposit scheme. Again, the retailers would have to be on board with this. They'd have to be prepared to collect the deposit containers, send them back to whoever cleans them, then they get sent back to wherever they're filled and so on. And so again, you hear there's a lot of sending involved, long distance transportation. I think we need to rethink the whole kind of business model again. We need to shorten the supply chains. We have to consume much more locally produced foods, and then have reuse schemes. So it's not as simple as just switching out paper for plastic, for example. On top of that, keep in mind that paper, for example, metals, they are coated on the inside. Paper can contain a lot of chemicals. You have the issue of migration. So just because it's not plastic doesn't mean it's automatically safe in terms of migration. Really important to keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe one last question. Luca, and I mean, I'm going to add to Luc. It's Luca Rabier in Peru, NG Peru. With the chemical found in recycled products, what is the best to do today regarding health? Go back to the past and use new plastic every time for a unique use, or continue to reuse and use recycled materials? Changes have to come from manufacturers, or our efforts to reduce plastics will result in an increasing toxicity. And I want to add, you too, as a consumer, how do you choose your products, given all what you know? And this will be the last question. So I don't know, Pete, you want to start, and then Jane?
One thing, major change I made in my personal life. There's not a single can for food in my house, and that's because food cans are usually lined with a bisphenol A based epoxy, and it's a major source of BPA contamination. This is, as Jane has emphasized several times, this is not a challenge that has a single, fast, simple solution. We're in it for the long haul. We've got to be using the science that's available. And actually, I thought Jane's comment about looking at the retailers is really important. They, for example, I've lectured in Bentonville, Arkansas, at Walmart's headquarters, meeting with the people who make buying decisions for Walmart. The power they have to just say no to a product is immense, and they are using it. They are shifting their suppliers in the right direction. But again, because of the complications that Jane mentioned, it's not overnight. It happens gradually.
Thanks, Pete. Jane, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, recycled plastic, we only touched on it now very briefly. We could talk for another hour and a half about this, but just very briefly, again, waste hierarchy, reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle is not the first choice. Don't hang on to plastic just because of the sake of the material. Try and really reduce the use of plastic. I think that should be the first step. Of course, there are essential uses of plastic. We covered that. For those, why not look at some kind of recycling? I wouldn't suggest recycling it back into food contact. I really don't think it makes sense for several different reasons. Maybe one material that would be an exemption is PET plastic. But keep in mind, when you do recycling, you have breakdown of the polymer molecules, which give the plastic its moldability, its properties. And so you always have to blend in virgin material. So there is no such thing as closed loop plastic recycling, where you can kind of recycle over and over. The plastic degrades after 3 or 4 times, it's done. You always have to put in virgin material. So, yeah, it's a difficult question, and I'm not sure if this really answers your question. Maybe one last comment. You write that the changes have to come from manufacturers. Yes, but they can be motivated to change. So I think at the end of the day, we are, as they say, consumers, and if we refuse to buy these things, then people will think of new ways to flog their products.
Yes, thanks. I think it will be the closing words. And I mean, I remember just 10 years ago, there were much less food packaging available on the supermarket, and it just got even crazier this last 10 years. And 10 years ago, we were also I mean, happy with the way we could consume products. So there is, all over Europe, in the US, in Asia, we see I never remember the word in English, but to buy food en vrac, like bulk distribution of product is rising, and that's a really nice way to just have no packaging at all for your food, and you feel much safer. So thank you so much, Jane and Pete, for taking the time to give us these powerful presentations. Thanks to everyone in the audience for your attention and the great questions added to the debate. I recommend all of you to have a look at all the great events organized by the Food Packaging Forum and the reporting they do, and also to follow and support the amazing science vulgarization work done by Pete's team in the Environmental Health News website. If you want to support Race for Water Foundation, please do not hesitate to contact us, visit our website, share our posts on social media, and we also obviously welcome donations, even more during these difficult times. If you are interested to know more about our history and our odyssey against plastic pollution, or if you are running out of ideas on Christmas presents, we published a book for our 10 years anniversary, written by our ambassador, the French alpinist and sailor Eric Loiseau. Last but not least, a big thank you to Jeanne, Frank, and Corentine on the backstage for your help in organizing this first episode of our webinar series. We will soon send you all the recording and the slides so you can help us share this important knowledge more widely. We are also planning to organize the following episode early next year, so please stay tuned. I wish you all a nice day, evening, night, wherever you are. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. I hope this has been fruitful and will help all of us collaboratively build a healthier future for ourselves and the ocean. Goodbye.